Welcome again to the K through 12 Revolution. I'm Gary Marvin Davison. Behind the cameras is Holly Hollister. Really want to thank her for her work behind the camera and also editing and all of the things that she does to make this program go. I want to thank Dwayne Smith, who has been here on occasion to do the recording for the show, and as always Kevin Jenkins, who is the producer and has also had days when he stood in behind the camera. Thanks to all of those folks for helping me make this program go. So this is the K through 12 Revolution. This is a program that presents to you a vision of what education can be. I do this in various ways. There are three main ways that I do it. I show you frequently the brilliant performance that students are capable of, those who are in my small group programs, such as Angelique Brown-Skinner, Davon Brown-Jamerson, William Allen, Devon Griffin, his little brother Javius. So many you have seen the capabilities of these students. We've had interviews. We had an interview with Edwige Mabonza, who is a physician from the Democratic Republic of Congo, telling us about an amazing and horrible situation there, and emphasizing that we in the United States, students, need to know more about these important international events. Had a wonderful interview with Kendra Wright, a brilliant young student who came up through the K through 12 system, took post-secondary options her junior and senior year, has a vision of being a neurosurgeon, and had so many pertinent things to say about the K through 12 education system. And then we have days of commentary, which is what this day is, in which I tell you very firmly and forcefully and clearly what I think we need to do to improve our K through 12 system. My focus is on the Minneapolis public schools, and what I have told you in the past is that in the United States, we like to think that we emphasize local control. In many countries, it's not that way. The best school systems in the world, in fact, in South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Germany and France and Western Europe, in fact, have national curricula so that you can travel throughout the country, and at the third grade, the fifth grade, the eighth grade, on into high school, the students are studying the same subject matter, taught perhaps in different ways depending on the pedagogical inclinations of the teacher, but with a good solid knowledge base that is defined at the national level. In the United States, education, like many other things, we're not as comfortable with mandates. I'm comfortable, but as a rule, folks in the United States are more oriented toward states' rights and local control, and so it's a federal system in which the federal government, the national government, has its duties, but its limitations as far as the public is concerned. We do have a good deal of educational policy that's made at the state level, and it's important. But when it gets right down to it in the United States, the action really is in the local school districts, because we say, bottom line, that school districts get the money, they follow the rules of the federal and state government in as much as they need to, but we really want a lot of decision making at the local level. That's what we say. The problem is that our K through 12 systems at the central school district level have not been adequate. And so you have various people attacking the central school districts for different reasons, wanting to sort of get outside the central school districts and provide options. My problem with that is that if we're talking about all of our students, the broad public, it will always be the centralized school district for as far into the future as we can see as a practical matter that is going to be the conduit for the knowledge and skills that our students need. So that's where we need to begin. And I'm beginning with the Minneapolis Public Schools. As I told you in the past, I've been very encouraged by the three key programs that Bernadette Johnson established while she was a superintendent. Superintendent Johnson stepped down as of the end of January of 2015. The new superintendent, as I've explained in the past, or the interim superintendent, as a decision is being made, is Michael Gore. Those programs are focused instruction, which is to provide knowledge and skill base uniformly throughout the grade levels. High priority schools, being clear that there are certain schools where students are struggling, and we need to do what we need to do to address those problems. And then a program called Shift, which is to shift resources from the central office building, maybe from some of those schools where the economic base is a bit higher, to those schools where the economic base is a bit lower, and to pour the resources that we need to make education accessible to all of our students. So those programs are very promising, but there's a lot of work to do. Superintendent Gore cut recently the central office staff from 651 to 530 or so. He cut it by about 120. So that's a remarkable reduction. I think there's more room to cut, but in terms of the Shift program, I give him his due on that. That's a remarkable achievement, something that school superintendents throughout the nation should hope to do. Very courageous, very decisive in the early going during his tenure. I have not heard as much about focused instruction, high priority schools under his tenure, and those programs still have a lot of work to do to fulfill their potential, but they're there, and we hope that they do. And that's part of my effort, is to keep the pressure on to make sure that there is the follow-through on those promising programs put in place by Bernadette Johnson during her tenure. I'll have some more things to say about that. I want to present to you today an opinion piece that was authored by a guy by the name of Ted Coldery, who has been at the Hubert Humphrey Institute. He has been associated with an organization called Education Evolving. And I'm going to read this piece and explain to you the point of view from which he comes, a point of view to which I take great exception. It helps to highlight some of the points that I make. It also helps to highlight some other approaches and to draw a distinction, and you folks can think about with whom you most agree. The opinion piece was, it appeared, let's see, on Sunday, April 19th, so it was not all that long ago. We're recording on the 22nd, is it? 25th, Saturday the 25th. So this was written not all that long ago. It was entitled "The City Schools Central Problem," with a subheading of, "A big district like Minneapolis has dozens of schools and all of them could be innovating. That is, in fact, the strategic plan. But the big brain, the central office, gets in the way." So it reads to begin like this, and I'll be stopping to comment along the way. It says, "Not long ago, Minneapolis was Minnesota's largest school district. Now, as the Star Tribune reported in March, Minneapolis fights school flight, March 19th, some 17,000 Minneapolis students attend other public schools. Departing board members openly wonder whether the organization can respond." I would imagine that the reference there is to Richard Mammon, who was the chair of the school board, and he departed. There was also Alberto Monserrate, who departed, and then there was Representative, hold on a second. So he's just putting that out there in the scattershot way that he does, without really explaining what relevance it has, except to assume that somehow this guy found his way to better education. We don't know that at all. On April 14th, the Minneapolis board did approve 4 schools in the partnership program, negotiated with teachers union to give existing schools greater autonomy. Bancroft, Fulwell Middle, Nellie Stone Johnson, and Ramsey Middle School. Now that's true, they did. Those are schools that had been given community partnership arrangements whereby they are going to be essentially pseudo-charter schools. They're going to operate very much like charter schools. They're going to have certain performance accountability arrangements. I have not seen those in detail, but I'm given to understand that they'll have certain expectations as far as math and reading. My problem with those schools is that, the best I can tell, they are going to be largely free from the mandates of focused instruction, which was Bernadette Johnson's idea, to get some curricular stability and consistency into all of the schools. So before you have fully realized that program, this is the classical approach of people in education. You start one thing, and before you finish it properly, you go off in another direction. So before following through on focused instruction and making sure that all of our 5th, 8th, and 10th graders are learning the same knowledge and skill base, they go off and give 4 schools independent roads to their own education with that same sort of scattershot approach of Mr. Coldering and the charter schools, hoping that somehow they will find a way to a better education. That's a cop-out. That is exactly what it seemed to me Bernadette Johnson was not doing. She was focusing on 3 things that really mattered and saying we need to pursue those. That's a problem. That is a problem when you can't get focused, when you can't be an adult, where you can't provide direction, and instead you say, we're going to give you a lot of freedom to find your own way. Have those marvelous innovations, and maybe somehow you'll do a better job than we've done. That's a lousy approach. That's an approach that does not take responsibility. How to introduce the autonomous and accountable arrangement is the question Minneapolis and the organizations that befriend it now need to discuss with the legislature. For decades, the national strategy has been to push improvement into the schools from above, he says, while leaving unchanged the structure of district and school. The strategy is not working well. It is time to try returning to schools and teachers the decisions about how to improve learning. No, you don't want to return to students and teachers the decisions on how to improve learning. You want to have teachers that have been well trained, that have the knowledge base to impart to their students who don't have that much experience in the world of knowledge what they need to know. So no, that's the kind of approach that comes out of our schools of education that has served our students poorly, especially those who come from families that are not very well educated, for decades and decades and decades. We need to be adults about this. We need to be professionals. We need to have a sense of what excellent education is and then go deliver it. We don't want to just open it up for teachers and students to find their way there. That's what has failed us for decades. It all sounds good, but it's not good. And so I want you to understand that. It is time, okay, arguably it is school autonomy, as if that is necessarily a good thing. More than small district size that makes education responsive to families, where they can adapt to the needs, aptitudes, and interests of their students, schools, and teachers, usually do personalized learning. That's another thing that sounds good. Personalized learning. I think that is a corruption of what we really need to do. We need to personalize understanding. That's what I do in my program. I know the history of every single student in my program. I know their families. I know their challenges. That's the kind of personalization that we need. We need to understand these children. We need to understand these students. We need to understand these people. But we don't need to personalize their learning, their education. We want that consistent. We want them all to know about math, natural science, history, economics, literature, all kinds of music, all kinds of art. No, we don't want to personalize that in the sense that each one has a different learning pathway. No. We want to be adults about it. We want to be professionals. We want to be educators. We want to send all of these students out there with a common, shared, rich, abundant knowledge base, because if we teach them all that they want to know, we'll teach them everything anyway. So, no, that sounds good. And the so-called progressive educators that understand, I'm far to the left on the political spectrum, so I object to using this term progressive as if this is a way to advance our students' learning. No, it sounds good, but it's not. And it's failed. The ironic thing is that he's presenting this as if it's something new, but this has been education professors speak for at least 40, if not 50 years. Where they can adapt to the needs, aptitudes, and interests of their students, schools and teachers usually do personalized learning. Motivated students make schools more successful. Oh, so students can only be motivated if they are given personalized learning where they can sort of have their input, drive their curriculum, teachers will be responsive to it, every student's different. No, that is an abdication of our responsibility. That's not what we need to be doing. That, again, it sounds good, but it's not good. We want to respect our students. We want to respect every single one of them so that they can be just as responsive to African American history and the great playwright August Wilson as they are to William Shakespeare. We want to provide them all a common knowledge base and be responsive to all of the wonderful cultures of our students, but not disrespect them as if they somehow have particular learning needs that other students don't have. As far as I'm concerned, that's a subtle form of racism. Maybe not so subtle. Motivated students make students more successful. You can see this in some of Minnesota's chartered schools or in the way Plymouth Youth Center. Plymouth Youth Center is not all that great a school. It's an alternative school, so it's an interesting example. For example, has adapted its contract alternative high school to its students on Minneapolis' Lower North Side. What does that tell you? It's adapted it to the students on the North Side. That's where I do my work, by the way. That's a very general statement. It's as if adapting the contract somehow is providing them better learning. We don't learn any details about what they're learning, and I can tell you, not too much. Delegating professional authority can ease the problem that is developing as Minneapolis and St. Paul. Yeah, it could ease the problem, but it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. You see, he's trying to opt for the easy way out. Desperate to show they are achieving in conventional terms, have been scripting teachers' work in ways teachers dislike and resent. Now see, he's not forthright there. He's talking about focused instruction, but he's not courageous enough to mention it and take it on head on. It's true, there has been a pushback from some teachers, but Mike Lynch at the Minneapolis Public Schools can tell you that many of the teachers have been very responsive. They said, oh, we appreciate this training. We should have had this training in education departments, in education schools. So he's saying something that's not true, and he's not being forthright. He's not telling you, and this is Cotery's approach in so many things, not telling you forthright exactly the program to which he refers, but taking a kind of side swipe at it. Very, very sloppy stuff here. This is dangerous. Oh, this is dangerous. This is dangerous, he says, to script teaching. Focused instruction, which is what he is referring to here, is not about scripting. It is about providing an essential chart for what students should learn. Teachers can go about it in different ways. They do not have to teach the same way. They can get the information across, but they've got to provide the same knowledge and skill sets. That's all. If that's scripting, it's scripting. He's using it as a pejorative. It's just nonsense. Quality people remain in teaching only where teaching is a quality job and a professional career. Who would object with that sentence, but he's tying it to things he said, and it just makes no sense in terms of his own argument. The way to do that, the way to provide teachers with a sense of dignity, is to train them, to insist that they come out of the university well-trained scientists and mathematicians and historians, elementary school teachers with strong knowledge sets where they go into that classroom. There's not this wishy-washy stuff about, oh, we're going to teach them to think critically and be lifelong learners when the teachers themselves know far too little and they have far too little expectations of their students. That's what could upgrade the teaching profession, not somehow giving them freedom when they really don't have the knowledge base and the wisdom to pursue that freedom, to use that freedom. You know, you got to think these things through. Also, a board can effectively hold teachers accountable for learning only when it gives them authority over what matters for learning. No, that's not what Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Finland, Sweden, the best school systems in the world do. They do not give teachers control over what is to be taught. The teachers basically know that because they come from certain fields, and what the national curriculum says makes sense to them, so they just understand, oh yeah, I'm a history teacher. I'm going to teach about Charlemagne in the Middle Ages as essentially the first Holy Roman Emperor. I'm going to teach about the Song Dynasty as a cultural high point in China. Makes sense to me, have no problem with that curriculum, but you don't want a teacher making that up on her or his own without the proper knowledge base to do that. But he suggests that that's what's going to lead teachers to somehow have more respect for themselves. The state ought to test the district on this score. Ought to see if Minneapolis wants to restructure into a self-improving system. Who would disagree with a self-improving system, but he never really gets around to saying what he wants to improve. You look in vain in this article for exactly what he wants to achieve with all this. He doesn't even mention math and reading, which we assume he means. But it shows you the fault in this kind of an argument, which puts all these generalities out there. What he's saying in the big picture is somehow innovation. Innovation and the freedom to explore will provide better education. Nothing could be further from the truth. Encouraging innovation at the working level while continuing to improve its existing conventional schools. Surely the Minneapolis district can do that, can't it? By way of concluding, let me say this. What would make the Minneapolis public schools better? To have a strong sense that it is knowledge that we want to impart to our students. Being courageous enough to say what that knowledge is in middle school and high school, to be sure, but there is a crying need for that at the K through 5 level. Say, we're going to be about knowledge, and so for these charter schools, our competitors, you try to be as good as we are, because we're going to have a strong curriculum. We're going to teach our students all they need to know in math, natural science, history, economics, literature, and the fine arts. We're going to retrain our teachers because we know that they're abysmally trained in our department schools and colleges of education. And we are going to have students that walk across the stage at graduation with a knowledge set and a skill base second to none. Now, wouldn't that be a strong competition? If they really did that, they'd be better than Edina and Eden Prairie and Minnetonka and certainly the charter schools. That's what would be truly competitive. So when people like Ted Coulter try to lead you down that road as innovation and doing things wildly different in terms of structure is what we need, I say that's a lazy way out. What we need to do is to get busy, to get down in the trenches, make our districts responsible in terms of what they define as education for our students, train the teachers to do it, because as I told the school board in the last appearance as I appeared here on the 25th of April, I said back in 1992, advisor to President, then candidate Bill Clinton, said he came up with a marvelously succinct expression. He said, it's the economy, stupid. He told Clinton, if you want to win this election, you're going to have to take a chapter from the Republicans' game, because they've convinced the American public that they know how to run the economy. So you talk about the economy, establish a viable plan. He did, and he won. I told the school board, I said, for you, it ought to be curriculum, stupid, teachers, stupid. That's what you need to do. So don't worry about all these generalities. Let's do what we need to do. Let's define a curriculum. Let's get the teachers to teach it. Let's have the K through 12 revolution. Let's do that, and we'll see you next time. Departing board members openly wonder whether the organization can respond. So two of the people he would be mentioning there, and I know that these two did show up at a recent public forum, and was Richard Mammon, who was the former school board chair, and then Alberto Monserrate, who was on the school board and was also a departing member. So if these are departing members, I assume that those are two of those he might mean. Fact is, the public urban school district is an endangered species. Harvard professor Jal Mehta is not wrong about there being a replacement strategy in motion. Openly now, it is said that there is no successful urban district anywhere in the nation, not one. The original concept was that there could only be one organization offering public education in a city, no matter how large. That is gone. In Minnesota and across America, state policy has created options for families. Options to enroll in other districts, to start college while in high school, that would be the post-secondary options, reference there, to enroll in public education's new chartered sector. Yet the big city district continues, organized like the fire department, its schools physically dispersed but centrally managed, back locked into the old model that gives it little ability to compete with the diversity of offerings appearing around it. Over to page 3, it continues in this Sunday edition of the Star Tribune, April 19th. This district needs the state's help. District structure exists in state law. The home rule power the state gave communities to restructure their local governments is not available for public education. The state reserves the authority to restructure education. In recent years, Minnesota's legislature has acted to restructure the K-12 system dramatically. But it has left in place the centralized district, and Minneapolis has for years had a hard time responding. Back in August 1984, the Minnesota Business Partnership invited Minneapolis Superintendent Richard Green, who was for many years in the 1980s the superintendent of the Minneapolis Public Schools, later school chancellor in New York City, to a discussion with its consultant, Paul Berman. Were inter-district open enrollment to be enacted, Green was asked, what would Minneapolis do? We'd complete like hell and be damn tough, Green said. And with 7 high schools, Minneapolis might have done just that, but it didn't. Nor did it pick up the chartering option aggressively when the legislature made that available to districts in 1991. The district's strategic plan says all the right things, like schools being the unit of improvement, but the central office hasn't carried it out. Directors of new schools have come and gone with little result. Now, we're getting into some issues here that he raises that I'll be making more frequent comment on, and I'll be going back to some of the things early in the article. One of the things that I want to call you folks' attention to is he says the district's strategic plan says all the right things, like schools being the unit of improvement. Now that's a very general statement, and it could mean a lot of different things. I wouldn't quarrel with that basic idea that yes, we want to start with individual schools. That's what I've said about the high priority schools. We want to do everything necessary at those schools, get the very best teachers who really know how to work with students from challenging home situations, who have had challenging school experiences, get those students out of class as necessary, work aggressively on the fundamental math skills. But as we go on, I think you'll get an idea as to what he really means by the school being the unit of improvement. But that's the kind of thing we hear all the time, general statements that sound good, and we just kind of let them go without being very specific as to what it is. So let's read on, and we'll see what he has in mind about schools, individual schools, being the unit of improvement as we go through the article. He goes on at this point, though, to say, now in Congress, the Republican chairs of the Education Committees, Representative John Klein of Minnesota and Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, want to enlarge the role of the states, rolling back the centralization that has so enlarged the role of the national government. Now, as you're going to hear as I go on through the article, Mr. Coterie doesn't really look very favorably on national government intervention. Keep in mind, though, that the best school systems in the world have a lot of national intervention, actually set the curriculum at the national level. So in the United States, we tend to look askance at that kind of thing. But when he uses this almost pejoratively as a negative, we want to put a red flag up there, and we'll be alert to that as we go through the article. That simply sharpens the question. What is the state's role beyond mandating rules and tests? Send money, districts answer. But asked about that at a meeting of the Achievement Gap Committee, a former chair, so that's Achievement capital A, Gap capital G, Committee capital C. That's a committee that's out there of local notables, legislators, superintendents, principals, and so forth who have come together to give us their wisdom on the achievement gap. I really have not read too much about that or know much about it. There are a lot of organizations that are out there supposedly working to close the achievement gap or to give us better education, and I have a lot of questions about those committees and those organizations. I don't see them very often at the meetings of the Minneapolis Public Schools, down in the trenches where the action really is. But in any case, this is one of those. So at the meeting of the Achievement Gap Committee, a former chair of the Minneapolis Board, Minneapolis School Board, Pam Costain said, "I am a liberal Democrat. I believe in public spending, but I have to tell you the problem this district has are not the kind of problems money solves." Now, that is a good point as far as it goes. We continue to throw money at a system that is structurally not changed. There is definitely a problem with that, and I've said that in the past. However, it's one of those statements that needs nuance. It needs some complexity and some explanation. If more money would mean to pay truly excellent teachers higher salaries, that would be a good use of money. If it's money that goes to pay the salaries of people in the central district office who mainly stare at computers all day, that's not a good use of money. If it's paying teachers who are not teaching our children properly, that's not a good use of money. So it really depends on how the money is spent, but I would agree with this as far as it goes. It's just like the other sweeping statements that we often read in this particular opinion piece. It's kind of put out there, left aside, and we've got to fill in the gaps, so I want to help do that. Now it goes on and it says some states took over troubled districts. New Jersey took over Jersey City, Newark, and Patterson. Michigan took over Detroit. Congress, as legislature for the District of Columbia, briefly took over the schools in Washington. Takeover was not a smashing success. Political pressures have quickly pushed the states to turn responsibility back to the locals. That's clear enough. That's part of the trend enough. It's what I said. This tremendous pressure to go to the local level, so we know that that's out there. Michigan now seems to be moving to return Detroit's district schools to local control, which might or might not mean things will then go well in Detroit. New York State and Illinois turned schools in New York City and Chicago over to former Mayor Bloomberg and Daley at their request. That approach breaks with America's peculiar tradition, a separate elected board running the schools. But elsewhere, in Finland, say, the general local authority handles public schools along with public works, public safety, public parks, and public child care. Some proposals for state restructuring failed the feasibility test. Nothing came of a proposal some years ago to dissolve the Minneapolis district and annex wedges of it to 8 adjacent suburban districts. This legislative session, a bill from Senator David Hahn, Republican, Eden Prairie, to break up Minneapolis geographically into 6 suburban districts, has not had a hearing. One of the things that I want you to notice about this opinion piece is it leaves a lot of ideas hanging out there. For example, that observation that in Finland, local authority handles public schools along with public works, public safety, public parks, in public child care. We're not sure exactly what Mr. Coldry seems to indicate by this. Is he in favor of that? Is he not? In many ways, he would seem not to be in favor of such a thing because he wants schools running independently. He's a big charter schools advocate. So it's not clear exactly what he means by that, and that's left kind of out there. Also, he's talking about the breakup of the school districts and whether or not that's been successful in the past. Basically it has not. But he's kind of leaving that idea hanging, at least for now. He leaves a lot of things hanging in the course of this opinion piece, very, very scattered, and I'm going to tie that into what I think his approach to education is about and what charter schools are about, which are also rather scattered. What might the state usefully do? He raises this question. If we said the state's job is to create an arrangement in which schools and teachers can work productively to help students learn well, what would that suggest the legislature do with a district like Minneapolis? That's more really general language if you're following this carefully. He says, if we said the state's job is to create an arrangement in which schools and teachers can work productively to help students learn well. He's assuming we all know what it means to learn well. That should not be an assumption. There are different views as to what learning well means. So when he makes a statement like that, he really is suggesting that we all sort of know what learning well means. So if we could just open up a situation in which teachers and students could find their way to doing that, we'd all be fine. It's a very general approach to education, though, and it makes assumptions that we really can't assume, and I'll have more to say to that. I've had more to say about in the past, and I will as I go through the article. But he goes on. He says, well, what if instead of breaking up the district, a restructuring broke it down operationally? That is, took the school board with its oversized central office out of running the schools. One of the interesting things throughout this opinion piece is this was written substantially after, at least 2 or 3 weeks after everyone had known that Interim Superintendent Gore had made those courageous and decisive decisions in the central school office and really cut 120 people out of 51 staff, so cut it down to 531 or so. He doesn't give Superintendent Gore credit for that. You know, he's talking about the oversized central office, and he's right on as far as the general situation, but he is criticizing the central school district as the unit of control and talking about oversized, but not giving credit for what actually is a positive move that's happened recently. So it's another one of those sloppy things in this opinion piece. Scattered, sloppy, not definite as to fact and detail. The board would remain as reconstructed by state legislation in 2006. Members elected partly at large, partly by district. It would concentrate on the key policy questions. What learning options do we offer? How much shall we spend? Who should run these schools and programs? How well are they doing? What happens if they do well or not well? So he's saying that under this attempt, back in 2006, there was the board to be left intact, but to raise these other questions. The board would have performance agreements with autonomous and accountable schools and groups of schools. Some of the schools or learning programs might be designed and run by teachers, as in fact a task force that Peter Hutchison chaired for Mayor Don Fraser in 1987 suggested. Look on the web for teacher-powered schools. So now we're supposed to run off to the web, look at teacher-powered schools, investigate something that happened back in 1987 to get our wisdom. Legislation restructuring the district could give the board the first option to design the new performance agreement arrangement. So he's talking about having individual schools have performance agreement arrangements, and then the central school district basically just monitoring whether they follow through on those. we never get the detail in this of what Mr. Cotery's vision as to what those agreements would entail. That is to say, what kind of learning? What would the students be learning? How would the teachers approach students? What shifts would we have in the sort of attitudes that teachers bring to their various populations, including those that are most challenged? We never get details on that. We just get that somehow it would be a wonderful thing for individual school districts or individual schools within the central school district to have performance agreement arrangements, and that would somehow make things better. The board might have a single agreement with its current administration or separate agreements with its 70 schools or agreements with some individual schools and some groups of schools, say those using a particular learning program, such as Montessori. So it could have separate agreements with the 70 different schools, groups of schools, such as those following a philosophy such as Montessori, or we could have a single agreement that would apply to all of the schools who would be then individually accountable. But in some way, there would be a performance contract that each school would sign, and then they would be left largely on their own to fulfill the terms of that agreement, with the monitoring then come from the central school district. Should the district not act in the time provided, the state would introduce the new arrangement itself. So initially, the responsibility would be the central school district. If it doesn't follow through with the performance agreements, the state would generate those, presumably out of the Minnesota Department of Education or the state legislature. He sort of leaves that hanging too. The object is to open the way for new approaches to learning. Traditional school would still be on offer in the district, but the restructured agreement would create a climate of encouragement for innovation, for new approaches to learning, keyed on personalizing learners' work. Now, I will have even more to say on this as I complete the article, because this is something very near and dear to my heart. One of the problems with a lot of the verbiage that surrounds discussions on education is a lot of things sound right. They sound good. Personalized learning. You know, we all like things to be personalized. Climate of encouragement. Innovation. Of course, in a capitalist economy, we're all about innovation. Now, let's think about these things, though. Let me read this again and make closer comment. The object is to open the way for new approaches to learning. My problem with that is I don't think that's the key problem. Talented teachers, if they truly are knowledgeable in their subject areas and they want to get through to students, they tend to find the approaches that they need. Most of the viable approaches to learning have been tried. Sometimes you have students working individually and the teacher comes up, sits down, offers help. Sometimes it's whole class instruction. Mr. Cotery in the past has written in a derogatory fashion about whole class learning. But in fact, in Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, systems that are very, very successful, the whole class approach is dominant. So he's all about innovation, new approaches to learning. And I just want you to think very clearly about that, particularly as I continue to make these comments as I do about the importance of a knowledge-based, skill-based education. And think about whether it's really wildly new approaches to learning that we need, or just more knowledgeable, capable teachers and a better sense of what we are teaching these students. Do we want them to walk across the stage knowing something about the background of Muslim history, the Umayyad, the Abbasid dynasties, and how those have caught the imagination along with the Ottoman dynasty of Muslims across the world? How many of our students know about those dynasties? And the fact that the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or the Islamic State of Iraq in Syria, depending on whether they want to be called ISIS or ISIL, that is now making mischief in Iraq and Syria. How many people, I wonder, know that part of what's in their imagination there is to create the greatness of the Muslim history, greatness of the Umayyads, the greatness of the Abbasids, the greatness of the Ottomans. That there was a day when Muslims held the knowledge of the Greeks and Romans and innovated upon that and made great discoveries and was at the cultural forefront of the world. And there's a certain resentment in Muslim societies that Western society has somehow taken more control of the international scene. I wonder how many people really realize that. I wonder how many people really realize the historical context for the Democratic Republic of Congo that Edwige Mabonza, the brilliant physician that was on the program, described in that country. Terrible atrocities against women, but a political system that has been corrupted and knew decades and decades of violence under Belgium control, and that was a colonialized people. I wonder how many people looking at the Ferguson situation understand that that's a product of history. And I wonder if they're really capable of tracing it as they should be, not only to the Civil War and slavery, but to the failure of Reconstruction. The fact that we should have had it all settled with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but somehow got deterred through the Compromise of 1877 and Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And I would submit to you that if some of that does not seem familiar to you, that's not entirely your fault, because you probably didn't learn it in the public schools, but you should have, because all of these situations have historical antecedents. And my point is that we don't want to just talk sloppily about innovation and new approaches to learning, because that's not really the key problem. The key problem is just not having the teachers who have the knowledge sets and the desire to get that knowledge across, and well-defined information that we want our students to know so that they can walk across that stage ready to go out into the world. Professionally prepared, yes, but also culturally enriched and civically engaged. That's education. You do not get that from Ted Coulter. He talks in general terms that we can sort of cling to, particularly in a capitalist society, like innovation and new approaches, and we think that automatically is a good thing. Some of that might be fine if it was in the service of a strong knowledge and skill base, and if it's in the hands of the truly excellent teachers we need, which is not a given either, and that's another issue that he does not tackle. So I am submitting to you as I go through this that he talks in glittering generalities of things that people might light upon and say, oh yeah, that sounds good, but if we think it through, not nearly as good as it sounds, and the most important things he never gets to. So then he says, he goes on and he says, do districts seek help? 3 Minnesota superintendents argued in 1998 for the legislature to help districts into the future. Don Helmstetter was president of the State Superintendents Association. Jim Walker was Minnesota's Superintendent of the Year. Tom Nelson had chaired the Senate K-12 Finance Committee and had been Commissioner of Education. Their Minnesota plan said, with inter-district enrollment, the post-secondary option, and chartering, with standards and assessments, the legislature has changed the world for school districts. We accept these changes, but in fairness, you need to give us the ability to compete in this new world. Now, one of the things I would point out here is who is stopping anyone from competing? There is a vision that I'll present more completely at the end of this article after I've read it, that I've mentioned before. I don't see that as a problem at all. The Minneapolis public schools could compete tomorrow if it had the right approach, and it's not the kind of approach that's suggested here. So he puts that out there as if that's a big problem. It's a big problem to compete. It's only a big problem if you think it's a big problem and you are put off by it, if you are intimidated by it. Need not be. More of that in a moment. Unfortunately, perhaps unforgivably, he says, the Minnesota School Boards Association and the Superintendents Association never took their proposal to the legislature. The new arrangements that might have developed in districts are developing instead in the chartered sector. So he begins to come toward more firmly something that is one of his convictions, that somehow charter schools provide an indication of where we should go, where the centralized school districts do not. Nothing, hear me on this folks, nothing could be further from the truth. We have a few charter schools in the Twin Cities area. Harvest Preparatory is pretty good. Hiawatha Academy is pretty good. They're not as good as their supporters and those who advocate for them think they are. They get some pretty good results on tests. They've done better than the central school districts, but those are exceptions, and they don't across the board provide that great an education. They've made some real gains in math and reading. I give them full credit for that. They're serious about what they do. They've tried hard, but whether that provides the vision of education, even in the best of chartered schools, that we want is a real question. And then the reality is that you will never read, not in this article and not in most of what Coterie writes, most charter schools are an abysmal failure. They're worse than the central schools. They don't pay their teachers as much. They don't have as rigorous approach to curriculum, as weak as it has been in the centralized schools. No, just because it's a charter school does not make it great shakes. And as far as I'm concerned, actually, having given rein to the charter school movement since 1991 in Minnesota, Minnesota was at the forefront of that, really has taken resources from the central school district, and it has diverted our attention, and it sort of provided an escape valve so students who have not been served by the centralized school district can somehow go off to charter schools and get a better education. I know for a fact that that's not true because I've worked with students from charter schools and independent schools, and generally speaking they have a poorer knowledge base and are floundering just as much, if not more, as students in the centralized school district. So look into the charter schools, see the statistics, read that, and know that Mr. Coterie, when he refers to the chartered sector as our great hope, nothing could be further from the truth. Here and there, a big district has been able to introduce the autonomous accountable arrangement itself, or at least has tried. In Edmonton, Canada, for example, Mike Strembitsky, a discontented teacher turned superintendent, worked over 20 years to get authority into the schools. He just noted that he did that. You know, he's assuming that's a good thing. We don't know what results that this guy got when he did that. It's more the scattershot approach of Coterie, which I would argue is sort of the scattershot approach of the charter schools, you know. Start charter schools, hope they work, give students and families and teachers a chance to do it on their own and hope somebody finds their way to an excellent education. That's a cop-out, really.